Dram's irises expanded like dinner plates under the ensorcelment of his eagle's sight spell, revealing the fell ritual in the valley below. 4 individuals dressed in dark, rust-red hooded robes surrounded the stone altar. Each held a strange device made from what seemed to be a mixture of bones, flesh, and metals. Each device matching the curves of a humanoid extremity. Each cloaked figure stooped down towards the aged, graying man laying upon the altar, placing each of their devices on an extremity belonging to the man. Dram watched intensely as each hooded figure placed their hands on the edges of the altar, which sank down like a great switch. As they stepped back, several mechanical appendages, topped with weird, strange, and wicked implements, found their way to the man's arms and legs. Dram fought his urge to look away from the carnage as the mechanical devices tore, cut, and hacked, surgically removing the man's arms and legs as he screamed like a living lamb on a particularly sadistic butcher's cutting board. Dram knew he needed to continue watching if he wanted his ally Edric, war priest of Paragon, the god of dwarvenkind, to successfully identify the signifying blasphemous markings: a black 8-pointed star, a bright blue shattered square, and a green spiral upon the robes of the cultish-looking figures below. Dram wanted to stop them here and now, but to intervene would ruin the carefully laid plan concocted by his team's diminutive scout Raleigh, which he was sure would work. He only hoped Mithronar, his team's elven swordsman, could keep his beliefs delivering merciless justice as swiftly as possible, held off at least until they could successfully track them back to their lair. The mechanical arms soon replaced the graying man's removed limbs with the strange but familiar-looking devices with a guise of humanoid arms and legs made from flesh and steel. With the replacements completed, the hooded figures quickly helped the man off the altar. He stood up, respectfully bowed to the 4. Then they all began making their way back to the safe house, making a few hand signs in front of his eyes, where he knew Edric would be watching through them with his pool of shared sight. He signaled him to prepare and rendezvousing at the cultist's lair entrance. With a complicated set of hand gestures, a shimmer covered Dram as he became invisible and moved stealthily from his position, keeping an eye on the cultist as he silently followed them. Getting the stubborn Edric to skulk through the cultist's lair with the rest of them wasn't easy at all. Dram's sudden heartfelt speech about not wanting to lose Edric most of all, as they all drowned in the rage of a few dozen cultists, seemed to catch him off guard and do the trick. Paragon, ancestor god of the dwarf war priest and his people, apparently made this one exception about being against skullduggery, as he granted Edric miracles of stealth, invisibility, and silence. With that, and Dram's own invisibility, combined with both Raleigh and Mithranar's talent for stealth, the team made it all the way through without being spotted to the end chamber, the lair's innermost sanctum, with ease. Both the halfling and Dram figured the leader of this insane cult of chaos would be in the sanctum. They would cut the head off of this foul snake and be done with it. Dram and his team stood in front of the ancient stone door, shaped as a circle and cut in 3 triangular pieces. The general symbols of chaos adorn the center of each piece: a many-pointed star, a shattered square, and a green spiral, along with a central symbol, a stylized mask with one side sporting half an open-mouthed smile, and the other half a large frown carved in the middle of the door, where the triangular pieces met. Each eye hole in the mask appeared to hold a small keyhole. Before Dram could even ask, Raleigh already had his locksmithing implements delicately jammed into each of the keyholes. The short halfling seemed to read his leader's mind. Giving a nod to the rest of the team, Raleigh slowly turned the lock open as the others readied their weapons, still invisible, shadows still clinging to them and obscuring their forms. Dram opened his hand as the lightning began to silently crackle, showing no visible light, drawing a somatic hand sign to cast the spell, breathing it in the same energies which made himself invisible. Flicking his wrist, Mithranar drew a gleaming Mithrilium dagger from his armor vambrace, falling into his palm, grasping it blade side. Edric whispered a prayer as a crossbow seemingly made from the shadows he cloaked himself in built itself, loaded and cocked into his hand as he quickly stammered a prayer of forgiveness to his no doubt unknown god. An infinitesimal click tore through the silence as Raleigh finally turned the double lock. The triangular pieces making the stone circular door slowly slid apart, opening wide. Raleigh immediately leapt to the ceiling, and with a quick whisper, stuck to it by his hands and feet like a small spider to a web. Daggers of magical steel flew, corals of shadow flown, and invisible lightning all shot towards the one cultist standing in the center of the room, back turned and hands outstretched toward the ceiling, seemingly in reverence. Robes, half black and half white, flowed, billowing in a non-existent breeze. In a flash, one of the cultist's arms unnaturally twisted behind him, facing his open palm towards them. As the unseen lightning nearly struck him, and instead veered toward the cultist's hand, absorbed harmlessly into the visible swirling void in its center. In the same motion, the cultist straightened his arm in a snap, sending the bolt back, colliding into the flying dagger. With enough power to instantly melt the dagger into slag, the lightning bolt continued unabated and slammed into Myth's chest, flinging him onto his back. His full attention earned, the cultist swung around with inhuman speed, catching the coral made from shadow with his frighteningly massive other hand. The sleeve which hid the shadow bolt-catching hand slid down, revealing an arm covered with faintly glowing, eerie blood-red lines, mimicking spidery veins. A simple flick of the fingers of his monstrous hand sent the shadowy coral screaming back at Edric, piercing through his shoulder. The priest of Paragon let out a stifled scream of pain as a blanket of freezing cold burned, spreading from his open wound and covering his shoulder.
Ah, wonderful.
The cultist's voice quietly boomed, seemingly in every direction around the team. Facing his void palm towards them, Dram, Myth, and Edric all slid toward him and into the sanctum, forcibly pulled slowly by his absorbing power. As the doors closed back, the cultist spat in annoyance.
Uninvited guests.
Raleigh scrambled into an unfamiliar vent-like opening in the corridor ceiling in which he was magically suspended, as his allies were pulled into the chamber by an unseen force. Following the pathway of the small vent, it led the halfling to an opening in the ceiling of the main chamber, directly above the target. Poking his head out, he witnessed his team being slowly pulled towards the rust-red robed cult leader. Clicking his tongue, Raleigh gave a sigh of annoyance. The cultist gave them the numbers advantage by closing the door behind them, and yet he can still hold them off as if they were nothing.
Great teamwork, lads.
Raleigh spoke under his breath, rolling his eyes in exasperation. Reaching into a hidden holster, the halfling pulled out a sleek metal weapon, a firearm from the nation of the Normirian Federation, one of the only places in the world to use such weapons regularly, and restrictive in selling them in open markets, wishing to keep a distinct technological advantage in a world where swords and sorcery were king and queen. Good thing he was an avid believer of the 5-finger discount, keeping his poor defenseless pockets from being drained dry by the ruthlessly greedy merchants of the world.
Guess I'll just have to save these sorry buggers again.
The halfling relented with a quiet chuckle. He suspended himself from the vent opening by one arm, one hand grasping the inner edge, while the other holding his gun, aiming it at the top of the cultist's head. Throwing another lightning bolt wouldn't help this time, Dramiel wondered, as he and his allies were continually pulled towards the cultist by his power. He couldn't allow them all to continue to be pulled, fearing the void in the cultist's palm could probably swallow them too, as it did all of their attacks. He needed a distraction somehow, he thought, as his eyes wandered toward the ceiling, spotting Raleigh, as a loud bang echoed off the walls of the chamber. Blood exploded from the cultist's crown as the bullet bore itself into his skull, ringing in the ears with a voluminous outer pain bellowing from deep within it. "There!" Dramiel exclaimed to himself as he sprang forward, allowing the dying pull of the rapidly closing void to propel him. With a simple, quick hand gesture, the half-dark elf shouted, "Inawe Magic Bolster!" He disappeared halfway from his target, reappearing a few feet behind him, reaching out as he shouted, "Olga Manus!" His hand erupted in bright, flashing lightning, when he shoved it into the back of the enemy's head. Raw electricity poured throughout the cultist's entire body as he stiffened, fast, uncontrolled. Seeing his own opening for some payback for the redirected lightning bolt, Mithranor pushed off the ground, spinning back onto his feet. In a flash, the tall elf warrior bolted towards the cultist currently being electrocuted, covering the length of the entire chamber in mere seconds. Drawing both his fine elven blades, he angled them, one to cut the cultist's arm off which held the void palm, the other to cut him in half. As Myth's swords were about to strike home, his eyes lit in horror as the cultist's red-veined, monstrous arm suddenly contorted across the cultist's body and grabbed at him. Jumping forward, the elf twisted to the left towards the void palm and spun away from the monster arm, dropping both his arms to his left. As his spin flipped his back toward the ground, the momentum carried his re-angled swords into slicing through the back of both the cultist's knees. As Myth continued to travel forward, the cultist fell forward as his legs were literally cut from under him. Sensing the momentum of the cultist's fall, Dram flipped forward, using his spell-delivering hand to vault over him as Edric took his turn, conveying Paragon's wrath.
By the Lord Father, give me speed!
The war cleric's voice rang in Fiat towards his enemy as miniature angelic wings appeared on the heels of his boots and the sides of his helmet. As he took a step forward, the small winglet flapped, propelling the angry dwarf with supernatural speed. Each step was granted the stride of a long-legged giant as he reached the falling cultist in nearly a moment. Drawing his blessed warhammer from his back as he strode, he shifted his weight to the side. He swung his hammer like a golf club with the fury of a god as the cultist's head hit the ground. The cultist's head immediately sank into his neck as his body was flung several feet away, tumbling and broken.
Woohoo!
The little halfling exclaimed as he fell from the ceiling into surprised Edric's arms.
We did it, lads!
"We sure did, little one," Mithranor agreed, his soft voice easily carrying through an eerily quiet chamber. Kipping up from his supine position, the elf warrior brushed himself off and began to saunter over his gathered allies. "Now, to figure out how to get out of here," without being chopped to bits by the rest of the cult.
We can take them, I think.
Edric suggested and postulated further.
If they realize we took down the leader, their morale might soar enough to rout the middle of them.
That's probably too risky, Dramiel muttered, shaking his head. We've given ourselves some breathing room. I suggest we use it to grab the cult leader's symbol of chaos and get the hell out of here.
He's right, I imagine.
Raleigh piped up with a chuckle and joked.
Besides, as much as I like showing you all up, I'd rather not have to save your solid bones from the fire again.
Don't worry about it. A mysterious voice answered as Raleigh's eyes dilated in shock. Looking down, his eyes fell onto a straight black blade sticking out of the top of his diaphragm, having burst through his back, right under his heart, running with blood. You'll never have to save your friends, the voice continued as the other spun towards the figure, seemingly flickering into existence at the end of the chamber opposite the door. A handsomely aged man with carbon black arms, dressed in a dark, fur-trimmed, open long jacket, as a small sword protracted from the top of his forearm, replacing the one he shot through Raleigh's back. He resumed. From their own stupid decisions again.
Dram.
Raleigh stammered weakly as he turned toward Dramiel, reaching for him.
Help me.
His small plea was cut off as the sword in his chest violently exploded. Myth reacted absent of thought as he back-sprang away in a flash. Dram quickly waved his hand up as a shimmer appeared in front of himself, a split second before the shrapnel collided with him. Edric barely had time to turn his back as the pressure wave blew him off his feet. The acrobatic elf was brutally blown away in mid-spring, while Dram's spell shield collapsed by the wave, and the half-dark elf was thrown hard onto his back. Raleigh! Dram faintly called out, wincing in pain as he tried to sit up. Pulling his hand away from his face to support his smarting back, he cursed aloud, noticing the blood smeared across his palm. Some shrapnel must have gotten through his spell shield and into his face, he figured. He drew a sharp breath in fear when he realized that half his vision was dark. Was his brain bleeding too? Shaking the thought for a moment, he pointed a finger where he believed the elf was blown away. The dark elf mage concentrated for a moment, then whispered, Myth! Get up! Mithranor immediately pushed himself off the ground from prone position to standing. His eyes fell directly onto the man in black, who had no doubt turned the little one into little chunks. Wait, Myth! He thought he heard those words spoken directly to his ears, as if someone were standing near him, but he ignored them. The receiver of his vengeance was still standing. He needed to fix that. With near-blinding speed, Mithranor, second son of Mithrandel the Strongest, wielder of the twin blades, Ochi-and-La, dashed forward for a moment before leaping through the air, his twin blades swinging down onto the man. A second blade sprang from the man in black's other forearm as he brought them both up in defense, intercepting the elf's swords with his own. He shifted his arms outward, using his forearm swords to smack Myth's own blades away from him, opening the elf's guard. As the elf fell onto him, the man cross-cut both his forearm swords across the elf's body, brought them both across the elf's neck, then caught him midair across his torso, as if catching a falling lover into his embrace. Myth's swords fell to his sides as the man gently laid the lithe elf's body onto the ground, bracing his neck, keeping his head from rolling off his body. The second son of Mithrandel the Strongest, wielder of the twin blades Ochi-and-La, was dead. Good night, sweet prince, the man stated as he drew his hand over Mithrandel's eyes, closing them forever. Dram's face contorted into sheer rage as he screamed, Progitie Gemini Magia! Slamming his fists together, lightning crackled around him. Slamming his foot forward, the dark elf shouted, Vivicia Magia! Inawe Magic Bolto! Disappearing, he suddenly appeared in the middle of the air above the man. Opening his hands, he slammed them together at the wrists, creating a bow-like shape and pointed towards the man. Yelling a command to the schools of magic, he invoked, Noctis Lucius Caelum! The lightning poured to the center of the bowl shape, and the deadly bolt streaked towards the man in black. Weakness spotted. The man in black stated to himself as the bolt of lightning shrieked from above him, as both blades retracted back into his forearms. Electricity crepitated through his arm and into his clenched fist as the lightning passed into striking range. He swung his fist at the weakness his chaos-empowered eyes perceived. The force of the blow sent the bolt screaming back at the poor, enraged Dark Elf mage. It collided with him, and he was blown upward. He slammed into the ceiling and fell, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Threat neutralized, the man in black stated to himself, turning towards the dwarf, finally picking himself up off the ground. He began walking towards the war cleric, an aura of determination emanating from him.
Abomination!
The dwarf spat in anger at the man. If you think so, the man in black answered sharply, his booted footsteps echoing gently as he continued forward. Well, then do something about it.
Pentagon!
Edric's voice boomed as he charged the man, his hand turning white from the death grip on his warhammer. As he approached the target, he swung with all his might, seeking to fell the man in black in a single blow. Hermes dash, the man calmly stated as his legs shined brightly with a yellow electricity, and he was suddenly in the air, effortlessly dodging the warhammer mere inches from his head. Edric overswung, his warhammer carrying him in a light spin. Stopping suddenly and regaining his footing, he looked up to see the man coming back down.
Now I got you, you bugger!
Edric shouted, reorienting his stance, readying himself to bat the man out of the sky. Hermes strike, the man muttered as his slow fall immediately sped up. Falling like a meteor, he clenched his carbon black fist and slammed a face-shattering punch on a shocked Edric, completely taken off guard. The dwarf's head smashed into the ground, a crater exploding into the stone floor, dust and stone particles kicking up everywhere. Landing in a kneeling position, the man in black slowly stood up and began striding toward the half-dark elf, who was standing up, surprisingly alive. You elves are certainly tougher than you look, the man commented as he approached Dram, clicking his teeth in annoyance at the abomination's backhanded compliment. His grips tightened on one of Mithranar's swords, which he picked up when he stood up. As the man came in melee distance, he asked the Dark Elf, "Any last words, kid?" Dram muttered, "Yeah. Progitie Gemini Magia. Monumentum Ladios Creptum Magia." The Dark Elf's arm thrust on its own volition, the sword tip colliding with the open palm. The man immediately interjected between himself and the attack. His confidence and his carbon black metal hand being able to easily stop the sword tip instantly disappeared from his mind as the mage's spells conducted through the blade struck home, blasting the man completely across the chamber, his back smashing into the closed stone door. Dram stooped down near the cultist as he willed to simply not collapse from utter exhaustion, and snatched the symbol of chaos off his crushed neck, an amulet in the shape of a stylized star made from arrow points in all directions. With a sigh, he took a few wobbly steps forward until he was directly under the vent. Casting so many spells in a short amount of time took their toll on his mana reserves, but his dark elf blood gave him access to a few tricks. Concentrating for a moment, he slowly floated upward. Reaching up, he grasped the inner edge of the vent and sluggishly pulled himself into it. The man slid down and slumped over with his back against the stone door, struggling to tilt his head up. He saw the elf was gone. Peering up at the vent, his pupils grew like dinner plates, glowing a bright blood red. "Smart sight," the man spoke to himself as his vision changed. A light scowl crept onto his face as he cursed to himself, realizing the stone walls, including the walls of the vent, were too thick for his exotic vision to pierce through.